When you think of medieval life, you might picture knights, castles, and kings. But for most people, survival depended on something far less glamorous: pigs. These animals weren't just food, they were fuel for daily life, woven into farming, markets, festivals, and even religion. Tonight, we'll explore why pigs mattered more than cows in the Middle Ages, and how their humble presence shaped centuries of history. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the quiet details of the past carry you toward sleep. Chapter 1. The Forest's Gift: Why the Pig Thrived in the Middle Ages. If you were to walk into a medieval village sometime in the 12th or 13th century, the first sounds you might hear would not be the lowing of cows or the braying of donkeys, but rather the grunts, squeals, and snorts of pigs. These animals were everywhere. They roamed the edges of forests, snuffled along muddy streets, and foraged in fields after harvest. While cows may dominate the image of farming in the modern imagination, sturdy animals pulling plows, providing milk, and grazing on green meadows, pigs were, in fact, far more central to the survival of peasants in much of medieval Europe. Their value was not glamorous, but it was practical, and in the day-to-day struggles of subsistence, practicality mattered more than symbolism. The medieval pig was not a carefully bred, pink, barrel-shaped creature like those we picture today. Instead, it was often a shaggy, wiry-haired animal with a long snout and tusks if it was left uncastrated. These pigs bore more resemblance to their wild cousins, the boars, than to anything you might find on a modern farm. They were hardy animals, able to survive on scraps, acorns, and roots. This made them ideal for peasants who had little land, few resources, and no surplus grain to waste on animal feed, unlike cows, which required valuable pasture land and daily care. Pigs largely took care of themselves. They were driven into the woods in a practice known as pannage, the seasonal right to graze pigs in the Lord's forest. There, they would feast on fallen acorns, beechnuts, and chestnuts, fattening themselves before the onset of winter. For peasant families, this was the perfect system. The forest provided the feed, and the pigs transformed it into meat. No farmer had to cut grass, store hay, or dedicate their precious fields to supporting these animals. This reliance on pigs also shaped the rhythms of medieval life. Each autumn, when the forest produced their bounty, the villagers would gather together to drive their pigs into the woods. It was a communal affair, and for weeks the animals would root and forage, overseen by swineherds, often children or the elderly, who were tasked with keeping the pigs from wandering too far. The pigs returned plump, ready to provide meat, fat, and hides that would sustain the community through the long, hungry months of winter. But pigs were more than just walking larders. They were adaptable, fast to reproduce, and useful in ways that cows simply were not. A cow might take years to grow into maturity, but a sow could produce litters of piglets twice a year. Even if disease or famine struck, pigs could replenish a household's stock quickly. For medieval farmers who lived in constant fear of shortages, this was not a small detail. It was the difference between survival and starvation, and then there was the meat itself. Pork was the most commonly consumed flesh in medieval Europe, particularly for the lower classes. Salted, smoked, or cured, it could be preserved for months. Fat, rendered into lard, was a critical part of cooking, used to fry vegetables or enrich stews. In a world where butter and oil were not always available, lard was indispensable. Even the bones and hides were put to use. Bones became tools, and hides were tanned into leather. Almost no part of the pig went to waste. The importance of pigs was also reflected in medieval laws and records. In the Domesday Book of 1086, which surveyed England under William the Conqueror, the rights of villagers to feed pigs in royal forests are meticulously recorded. These rights were valuable, often jealously guarded and tightly regulated by lords. A peasant might not have the freedom to hunt deer or boar, but they could send their pigs to forage, paying a fee in the form of coins or a portion of the pigs themselves. The fact that kings and nobles concerned themselves with the management of pig rights shows Just how economically central these animals were. Cows, in comparison, occupied a different place in the medieval economy. They were vital for plowing fields and for producing milk, but they were also expensive to maintain. Only wealthier peasants or lords could afford to keep many cows. Their milk, while useful, was perishable and had to be quickly turned into butter or cheese. Their meat was rarely consumed except on special occasions, since slaughtering a cow meant losing a valuable work animal. For the ordinary farmer, then pigs offered much more: cheap to feed, quick to breed, and ready to provide both food and material. Yet pigs were not without their challenges. Their habit of roaming freely meant they sometimes destroyed crops or rooted up gardens, leading to quarrels between neighbors. In towns, they could become a nuisance, darting through streets, knocking over market stalls, or spreading filth. There are accounts of pigs causing accidents, even trampling children. In some places, they were so troublesome that laws were passed to regulate their presence in villages. Still, despite the inconvenience, no community could really do without them. As you imagine this medieval landscape, picture the fields just after harvest, with stubble still covering the ground. Into these fields, the peasants would release their pigs to glean the last of the grain. In the forests, swineherds carried staffs and shouted to keep the animals together, their voices mixing with the oinks and grunts. The rhythm of life was tied not only to the sowing and reaping of crops, but also to the fattening and slaughter of pigs. When winter approached and the air turned cold, the slaughter season began. Families came together to kill their pigs, salt the meat, hang the hams, and render the lard. It was grisly work, but it was also a time of communal labor and preparation, ensuring survival through the long dark months ahead. The preference for pigs over cows was, in many ways, a reflection of the realities of peasant life. Cows may have represented wealth and stability, but pigs represented practicality and survival. They were the animals of the common people, tied to the cycle of subsistence farming, forest rights, and village life. Their very presence in laws, markets, and daily meals is proof of their importance. Still, one might ask, was this reliance on pigs purely a matter of survival, or did it also shape the culture, economy, and even the spirituality of medieval people? Did pigs, humble as they were, leave an imprint beyond their usefulness as food and fat? Chapter 2. The Economy of Snouts. How pigs shaped medieval trade and status. When you think of medieval trade, perhaps you imagine bolts of cloth, iron tools, or barrels of wine moving through market squares. Yet, beneath these more glamorous images of commerce, the pig lurked quietly, shaping economies in ways that were so ordinary they often went unremarked. The pig was not only a source of food, it was a kind of currency, a measure of wealth, and a practical tool for negotiating status in medieval society. To begin, it is worth recalling that medieval peasants often lived in a world with very little money in circulation. Much of life was governed by barter, obligations, and exchanges of service. In such a world, livestock stood in for coin. A piglet, a sow, or a fattened hog could be worth as much as, or sometimes more than, a handful of silver pennies. In records of manorial courts, we see pigs being used to pay fines, settle debts, or fulfill obligations owed to the lord. A family unable to produce coin might offer a pig at Michaelmas, the feast marking the end of harvest, as a token of their dues. The market economy of pigs was also tied to their seasonal cycle. In autumn, after the forest pannage had fattened them, pigs reached their peak value. Traders and butchers moved from village to village, purchasing animals for slaughter and sale. The air of a medieval market in October or November was filled not only with the smell of bread and ale, but also with the squealing of pigs being traded. Some were sold live, to be kept over winter by wealthier households. Others were slaughtered on the spot, their meat salted down and sold in barrels. The trade in pork products was vast, stretching from small villages into the larger networks of towns and cities. Salted pork in particular became a commodity. Unlike fresh meat, which spoiled quickly, pork preserved with salt could travel across regions. Monasteries, castles, and towns all relied on these supplies to feed their communities during winter and Lent, when restrictions on fresh meat meant preserved products were in higher demand. The pig, then, was not merely a local animal, but part of a wider trade network that linked peasants to markets, merchants, and even distant consumers. In some places, the importance of pigs became so entrenched that entire economies revolved around them. Normandy, for example, was famed for its forests, where pig pasturing rights were crucial. English villages recorded their annual payments for the right to graze pigs in the royal forest, known as pannage fees. Lords carefully counted how many pigs each tenant sent into the woods, and fees were assessed accordingly. The fact that this system persisted for centuries shows how stable and central the pig economy was. Yet, pigs also reflected social divisions. Wealthier peasants with more resources might raise large herds, sending dozens into the forest each autumn. These pigs could be sold for profit, turning livestock into liquid wealth. For poorer peasants who might manage only a single sow, the pig was not an investment, but a lifeline. That one animal could provide a year's worth of meat and fat, making the difference between hunger and survival. The contrast between pig as wealth and pig as subsistence mirrors the broader inequalities of medieval life. Beyond their economic role, pigs also carried symbolic weight. In charters and accounts, they appear as tokens of status. A gift of a boar to a lord, for instance, was a sign of loyalty and obligation fulfilled. Feasts often featured pork as a central dish, roasted whole to display abundance. When chroniclers describe great banquets, they often mention swine alongside beef and venison. Pork, accessible to commoners and nobles alike, occupied a unique space, humble enough to be everyday fare, but versatile enough to grace elite tables. Even religion, which shaped so much of medieval life, was not untouched by the pig's presence. While pigs were sometimes associated with gluttony or uncleanliness in biblical terms, in practice they were indispensable to the diet of Christian Europe. Fasts and feast days structured when pork could be consumed, but the animal itself remained central. Monasteries often kept herds of pigs, their meat sustaining monks during the long months when fresh vegetables were scarce. In many abbey records, we find careful lists of swineherds, numbers of pigs, and the profits derived from their sale. One particularly interesting aspect of the pig economy was its connection to women's work. While men often handled the plowing and the heavy labor of the fields, women played a central role in tending smaller livestock, including pigs. Feeding piglets, ensuring animals did not stray, and processing pork after slaughter often fell to women. Thus, the pig was not only an economic pillar but also a domestic one, linking women's household management to the broader rhythms of medieval survival. The pig's place in law is equally revealing. In many manorial records, disputes over pigs surface again and again. A sow straying into another man's garden, a boar damaging crops, or accusations of theft of piglets appear in court rolls. These cases show how tightly pigs were interwoven with the fabric of daily life. They were too valuable to be ignored, and their mobility made them constant sources of tension. In towns, the problem was even sharper. Pigs wandering freely down narrow streets could cause havoc, and authorities sometimes banned them from urban centers altogether. Yet enforcement was lax because the animals were too essential to too many households. To put it simply, the pig was a creature of paradox, humble yet valuable, nuisance yet necessity, filthy yet life-sustaining. Its snout could uproot a neighbor's field, but its body could keep a family fed for months. Its fat fueled the lamps that lit dark winter nights, while its hide provided leather for shoes. All of these details, recorded not in grand chronicles but in everyday accounts, reveal how much pigs underpinned the invisible economy of medieval Europe. As you picture a medieval market, imagine the sights and sounds: barrels of salted pork stacked beside wheels of cheese, traders shouting over the squealing of live animals, coins clinking as pigs are weighed and sold. Somewhere in the corner, a peasant family haggles over the price of a piglet, hoping to secure their food supply for the coming year. This was the heartbeat of the peasant economy, not battles, not royal decrees, but the trade of pigs still. There is a lingering question. If pigs were so central to the medieval economy, why did cows continue to symbolize wealth and prestige in art and culture? Was the humble pig overlooked in the stories of the past simply because it was too common, too ordinary, too tied to the unromantic details of survival? Chapter 3. From Forest to Feast, the cultural life of the pig in medieval Europe. By now, you have followed the pig through the peasant's field, the manorial forest, and the bustling market square. You have seen how it rooted through the undergrowth, grew fat on acorns, and eventually became a pillar of both survival and trade. Yet the story of medieval pigs does not end in the marketplace. To understand their true importance, we must turn to culture, ritual, and the long arc of history that transformed the pig from a forest-dwelling forager into a domesticated staple of European life. The pig was, in many ways, the most visible animal of the medieval countryside. Unlike cows, which often grazed in enclosed pastures, or sheep, which were herded on common fields, pigs were highly mobile. They wandered roadsides, village greens, and even town streets. A medieval traveler passing through a village would almost certainly encounter pigs trotting between houses, snuffling in ditches, or nudging their way into doorways in search of scraps. Chroniclers sometimes complained of the unruliness of these creatures. In London, ordinances were passed to keep pigs out of certain districts, but enforcement was uneven. For many households, keeping a pig meant keeping food security close at hand, yet pigs were more than animals on the move. They were woven into festivals and traditions. The annual slaughtering season, usually in late autumn, became a community event. Families worked together to butcher animals, salt the meat, and prepare sausages. Neighbors exchanged cuts of pork, recipes, and favors. This period was not only practical but celebratory, marking the end of harvest and the beginning of winter. In some places, the Feast of St. Martin, held in November, became associated with the eating of pork, giving rise to the saying, "Every pig has its Martinmas." Feasts in noble households also highlighted the cultural role of pigs. While beef and venison might carry connotations of wealth and prestige, pork was adaptable. A whole roasted piglet, golden and crisp, might appear as a centerpiece at a banquet. More ordinary dishes, pork stews, sausages, black pudding made with pig's blood formed the backbone of everyday diets. Pork was versatile enough to belong equally to the tables of peasants and princes, a rare bridge across class divides. This cultural prominence found echoes in literature and art. In illuminated manuscripts, pigs appear in marginal drawings, often humorously depicted rooting or tumbling about. Bestiaries, medieval books describing animals with moral lessons, sometimes used pigs as symbols of gluttony or laziness, reflecting their reputation for eating indiscriminately. Yet these depictions often carried a wry tone, as if the writers knew full well that, for all the moralizing, no society could survive without the pig. In music and ritual too, pigs made their mark. Certain festivals involved mock pig hunts or plays in which characters carried pig masks. Rural songs celebrated the fattening of pigs or the sharing of pork at weddings. Even the language of the pig entered everyday speech. Medieval English words like swine and hog were used not only to describe animals but also as metaphors for human behavior, sometimes affectionate, sometimes scornful. Religion complicated the picture. While pigs were valuable, they also carried associations with sin. Preachers warned against becoming like swine, dirty, greedy, and unrestrained. Monastic writers, concerned with discipline, sometimes invoked pigs as images of vice. Yet monasteries themselves often kept herds of swine, their prophets supporting religious life. This tension between symbolic impurity and practical necessity captures much of the medieval mindset. where daily survival existed side by side with moral ideals. As centuries passed, changes in land use and agriculture began to reshape the pig's place in society. Deforestation, enclosure, and the expansion of arable farming reduced the availability of common woodland for pannage. Fewer peasants could send pigs into the forest, and the cost of maintaining herds rose. Meanwhile, sheep became increasingly important in regions like England, where the wool trade brought immense profits. Slowly, the pig shifted from being the centerpiece of rural subsistence to a more specialized part of the economy. Yet it never disappeared. The adaptability of pigs ensured their survival even as economies changed. In towns, they continued to live close to people, thriving on scraps and refuse. In the countryside, they remained central to household economies, particularly for those who could not afford cattle. The decline of the great pig herds of the forest did not mean the end of the pig, but rather its transformation into a domesticated, enclosed, and ultimately modern farm animal. Looking back, it is easy to overlook the pig in the grand sweep of medieval history. Chronicles speak more often of kings, wars, and saints than of livestock. Art celebrates knights and castles, not swineherds and their charges. Yet if you examine the quiet details, the manorial records, the market accounts, the household inventories, you find the pig everywhere. It was the meat on the table, the fat in the lamp, the leather on the feet, the coin in the market, and the gift in the feast hall. The pig's story is, in many ways, the story of ordinary survival. It shows how people adapted their lives to the resources around them, how they created traditions and economies from the humblest of creatures, and how the rhythms of life were shaped not only by kings and battles, but by animals snuffling in the dirt. And so, as you picture the medieval countryside one last time, imagine not only the great halls and cathedrals, but also the pigs wandering beneath oak trees, squealing in market squares, and roasting on spits at winter feasts. Without them, medieval life would have been poorer, hungrier, and far less secure. Still, a curious thought lingers. If the pig was once so vital, how different might history have looked if forests had vanished earlier, or if cultural taboos had made pork less acceptable? Would Europe have been shaped more by sheep, cattle, or goats, or would another animal have filled the pig's humble but indispensable role? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight here on Quiet Boring Sleep. I hope the slow details of history helped you unwind and drift a little closer to rest. If you found comfort in this journey through the past, I'd be so grateful if you could gently tap the like button. And if you'd like more calm stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these long, sleepy histories coming. Until next time, may your night be peaceful and your dreams calm.